Hello and welcome to the Gospel of Grace podcast, where you hear the good news week in and week out. Well, thank you so much for tuning in today. Today is podcast number 8, and I'm starting a series which I'm really excited about, and I'm calling this podcast Identity Strand Essentials. So what I'm going to be talking about is our identity. I'm going to be setting up a foundation for multiple podcasts that are going to be coming out soon. And I've called it Identity Strand Essentials because I'm going to be explaining the backbone of identity. I'm going to be explaining what our identity is as a whole and why it matters as a whole and why I'm doing this series so that you can begin to be aware of what your identity is. But as I lay down the foundation today, you'll be able to hear an upcoming identity podcast that I'm doing, which I will be calling them Identity Strand as well, but I'm going to tackle aspects of our identity in each and every single one. So, for example, the next podcast I've got laid up is going to be Identity Strand 1, which is you are a child of God. So, so in that, I'm going to talk about the fact that we're children of God. That's just one piece of our identity, though. We're more than children of God. There's so much more to our identity than that. So you can see how there's multiple different aspects that make up the whole new selves that we have become in Christ. So I felt that it was good to start a podcast off, start the series off, I should say, with a podcast that explains and lays down the foundation that the rest of the podcast can just be tucked into. That'll make it a lot easier, so when you hear the other podcasts, you've already got a base to work with, and you're not looking around going, well, wait a minute, what of the identity? Yeah, I'm a child of God, but what about it? Why do I care that I'm a child of God? Or maybe you already know you're a child of God, but what's the aspect of it? What kind of depths and meaning could that possibly hold that you've never even thought about? So I definitely want to get to that, but that's in the next podcast. Children of God, we're children of God. That's going to be the first identity strand, and I've got many to follow. But again, just want to jump in this one, get this one rolling out. So Identity Strand Essential. So okay, so what is identity anyway? What's all this identity talk? What's identity all about? Well, identity is who you are known as. It's who you actually are. It's who you are. And so there's only two possible identities any human being on this planet can have. Either you're unsaved, you're an unbeliever, and your identity is in Adam, which has a whole bunch of effects as a result of that, a whole bunch of strands. Your identity strand, if you're in Adam, could be things such as having a sinful nature, being a slave to sin, being dead to God, being deceived. Those are some of the things that would be your identity if you were in Adam. But if you're in Christ, and that's of course what I'm going to be focusing on, is for people who have put their faith in Jesus Christ, and people who are Christians, children of God, your identity is in Christ, and that's the foundation of your whole entire life, really. That's the foundation of everything that you do and think and act out upon is from the source, is sourced at your identity. It comes from your identity. Now, of course, we have the life of Christ living in us, and we're certainly, Jesus is doing a good work in us, which he said he would carry on to completion. So God definitely is causing growth in our life. There's no question about that. But it's important to be rooted and established and solid in our identity, because that's going to affect a lot of the choices we make. Jesus can be working in us, but if we're ignorant, and I mean ignorant as unknowing. That's what I mean to say when I say ignorant. I don't mean someone who's dumb. I'm not saying I'm not saying that. I'm saying anyone who just has a lack of knowledge about their identity. It's impossible to act in agreement with who you are in Christ when you don't know who you are in Christ. It's hard to make choices based upon your identity when you don't know what your identity is. But when you do know what your identity is, you're empowered and encouraged to make good decisions that'll affect every aspect of your life. So identity really is at the core of our decisions that we make, and our behavior and our actions and attitudes and mindsets. Knowing your identity is going to change everything. Otherwise, everything else is going to flow from your identity. So it's very, very important. Of course, we get our dependency is upon Christ. Christ's life is within us. We're dependent upon Christ. But again, knowing your identity will affect your life choices in the end. And I think that's really important, because we all have many choices to make every single day. So your identity is going to help you today and for the rest of your life. So your identity is who you are, and knowing who you are and all that that means is to be a Christian who understands his identity well, and that's going to affect his or her lifestyle, his or her attitudes and actions, his or her mindsets, his or her confidence and boldness. Everything you do, again, is going to flow from your identity. So it's so important to know what your identity is. But now that you have an understanding of why identity matters, what identity is who you are, why identity matters because it affects every decision you make, then now that we've laid that foundation, there's something else that's really essential that I want you to see too. And that's the idea, when it comes to our identity is one thing, and then how the thoughts that we have, the thoughts that we get, the thoughts that we allow ourselves to think, and in the in our thought life, there can be very different outcomes between the two. For example, your identity might be one way, but your thoughts can be completely contrary to that. So how can that happen? If we really do have a specific identity in Christ, for example, we're in Christ as children of God, how can we then think thoughts that are contrary to that? How can we think thoughts that are fleshly, boastful, arrogant, prideful, selfish, harmful, hurtful, angry, jealous, all these other things? How can we be thinking in those other ways that are completely opposites of who we are? Well, of course, as you get to know your identity and grow in it, our thoughts and attitudes and actions will begin to line up, and outflows the new self that we are. I was kind of stumbling on my own words there, trying to think of how to say that, but outflows, what outflows will be good. Well, it'll be desirable. It'll be in accordance with who we are. That's kind of the point. Our identity is in Christ, and we want our outward living to be such. But how we get there isn't by trying harder and doing more. It's simply by understanding who we are and then acting upon it. But while it's simple, there's still a lot of learning and growing to take place, which takes time. Simply because there's just so much to understand about our identity. While it's simple on the surface, it's also very deep, profound, and amazing. This finished work of Christ has given us our new identity, which is awesome and absolutely amazing. So but yeah, anyway, another real important thing here I was trying to get to, I kind of went the long way around. Sorry about that. I sometimes do that. But anyway, one thing I want to get clear on this particular podcast before I begin the specific strands of who we are as children of God, what our identity is in multiple different facets of our identity. Before I begin looking at any of those, one thing I want to hammer home today is that the understanding of what's really going on. So what I mean here is that we are a spirit living inside of a body, and we have a soul. So there's three parts to human beings. And this is important because if we understand this, it's going to help us to be experience so much more freedom as we grow in God's grace and we grow in the identity that He's given to us as a free gift. We'll be encouraged to live outwardly that way, and as we understand that our thought life is happening in the soul realm, and then our spirit, that's who you actually are. You are a spirit. Your human spirit, who you actually are, is what your identity is, and it's unchanging. But your soul, the soul life that you have, where all your thoughts take place, and where we get thoughts from other people, thoughts from the flesh, thoughts from the power of sin, thoughts from the enemy, and then we have our own thoughts besides that. So you have all that going on. That's all going on in the soul realm. The soul, in your soul, that's where all the thinking comes in. That's also called, it comes from the Greek word psyche, which we get our word psychology from. So, we can see different passages that clearly distinguish the difference between psychology and that's our soul life, and then our human spirit, and that's who we actually are. In our human spirit is where our identity is, and our identity is solid and secure. In our thought life, in our soul life, that's an unstable territory where all kinds of thoughts can enter in, and a lot of those thoughts are not your own, and that's why you get those ugly, dirty looking thoughts sometimes, because they're not coming from you. They're coming from the power of sin. They're coming from the enemy. In this world we have many enemies. We have the world, we have the flesh to deal with, we have the power of sin to deal with, we have demons to deal with, and the devil himself out there. So, we have many enemies, and it goes without saying that not every thought you have inside of your soul comes from you. And that's something you already know, because you've gotten thoughts before that are like, man, where'd that come from? That wasn't me, No, you're right. If you're a Christian, that's absolutely true. Not all your thoughts are your own. So my point in saying that, the difference between soul and spirit, and understanding your identity is your human spirit, are locked in place and absolutely unchanging. That's important to hammer down. That's important to know, because in your soul life you'll get all kinds of thoughts, but you're not your thoughts. However, what you choose to set your mind on and think about can absolutely affect how you act outwardly. And that's why we want to renew our minds. That's why Paul tells us to do that in the first place. In Romans 12, chapter 12, verse 2, he tells us, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, because he knows that as we think upon things, as we believe things in our soul life, as we come to the knowledge of things, it will affect how we choose to live our lives, how we make our decisions. So your identity is tied to your human spirit, and that's unchanging, absolutely unchanging. And your soul life, which is unstable, there we can begin to line up our soul life. We can begin to renew our minds to the truth of our identity, and lo and behold, we begin to see that in our lives we begin to live outwardly as we already are inwardly. But that's something that's a matter of growing and knowing who we are. And that's so important. And so that's why I'm doing this identity series in the first place, is because I want you to know who you are. But I wanted to do this introductory podcast because I wanted you to realize the truth about our identity, why it matters, why it's so important, how it can affect your everyday life, and the simple fact of the distinction between spirit and soul. Spirit is who you are, child of God, holy and blameless, clean and close. You're in the spirit, not in the flesh. You're holy and blameless, you're righteous, you're justified, you're clean, you're a new creation. All these things are your true identity. But in your thought life, you need to renew your mind to that truth, because your thoughts can be very contradictory towards that. But just because you have thoughts that say you're a dirty worm, you're a terrible sinner, things like that, those thoughts do not actually indicate the truth, are not necessarily aligned to the truth. Not everything you think is true, and not every thought that you receive is from God either, because like I said, we have the enemy, we have the pull of the flesh, we have temptation from the power of sin. The power of sin is in us that tempts us. That's Romans 7. Paul talks about that. So the victory over that is knowing what the truth is. and being able to let the truth set us free. Jesus said the truth will set you free, but you have to know what the truth is first, and the truth is your identity is solid and secure and unchanging, and it's been given to you as a free gift by the grace of God, not earned through human effort, and that's good news. So come and hear all about your identity. The specifics are coming up. The next podcast I do, podcast 9, will be the first identity strand. And I'm going to be talking about the fact that we are children of God. So I hope you'll come and check that out on YouTube and on my website. The links are there. Check it out at the Gospel of Grace podcast, where you hear the good news at week in and week out. Every podcast is meant to be good news. Come listen to podcast 9. I'll have it available soon. Thank you. Take care.